Conditions. Resuming debate.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It is my honor to be speaking to you virtually here from Toronto, but in the House of Commons on Bill C-5. This is an important piece of legislation on the path to reconciliation that I firmly believe will help in shaping a better future. I want to note, first of all, that when I speak to you here from my riding of Parkdale High Park, I am located on traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd also like to say miigwech, which means thank you, in Algonquin, for giving me the chance to speak before the Chamber on this important topic, acknowledging that the parliamentary precinct where you are, Madam Chair, is on unceded Algonquin territory. I would also, before beginning, want to acknowledge the important work done on this initiative by former NDP Member of Parliament Georgina Jollybois, who presented this bill in the 42nd Parliament. And at that time, during debate, she said, quote, "This bill will not solve the housing crisis Indigenous people live through, and it will not fix the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in foster care, and it will not close the education gap that leaves Indigenous children behind. However, it will give Canadians the opportunity to fully understand why those problems exist," end quote. I think that is a very succinct and sound analysis of the situation and also of the importance of this bill. And I thank her for her advocacy during the 42nd Parliament. Now, Madam Speaker, we've heard during debate on this bill about the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and we know it released its final report in 2015, and our government, the Liberal government under the Prime Minister, accepted the conclusions of the TRC. This in-depth study of Canada's history was mainly looking at the legacy of the residential school system. There were 94 calls to action, of which we have heard many about many. And Bill C-5 will address in particular call to action number 80, which states, quote, "We call upon the federal government in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples to establish as a statutory holiday a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation to honor survivors, their families, and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process." The relationship with Indigenous peoples is a critical one, and the implementation of this call to action is one step forward towards that reconciliation. Clearly, Madam Speaker, there's a long, long way to go, and you've heard about that from many of the speakers on this bill today and last week. Canada indeed has a poor history and track record when it comes to the relationship with Indigenous persons. In a debate like the one we're having today, it's important to acknowledge mistakes from the past in order to build forward better. We are all now well aware of the atrocities that happen in residential schools and their consequences, and I will touch on the point of education a little bit later. We are aware of generally of the intergenerational impacts on survivors and their families. We're also aware of the consequences of the 60s scoop, Madam Speaker, that it took so many Indigenous kids away from their families. Finally, we're aware of the ongoing systemic racism and systemic discrimination that is still happening in Canada. We saw the heartbreaking video published by Joyce Echaquan during the last minutes of her life, mentioned by the previous speakers from the Bloc Québécois. We know about systemic racism being faced by Mi'kmaq fishers in Nova Scotia as we speak. Fishers that dared to exercise their treaty rights to fish for a moderate livelihood, as upheld in 2 Supreme Court decisions in the Marshall case 21 years earlier. The violence we have seen in Nova Scotia, Madam Speaker, is never acceptable, and the systemic racism we have witnessed in Nova Scotia must be eliminated via leadership on the part of all parties, including law enforcement in Nova Scotia. That is why we need to move forward with all of the calls to action from the TRC. But I want to focus now on call to action 80 and urge my colleagues to support this piece of legislation. Now, this piece of legislation talks about September 30th, and we've heard about this, Madam Speaker, in the context of Orange Shirt Day, the current moniker for September 30th. Established in 2013, Orange Shirt Day helps raise awareness about the long-lasting impacts of residential schools and honors the resilience and courage of survivors while focusing on the experience of students at residential schools and indeed those who didn't survive. This day is based on the heartbreaking story of Philip Webstad, which remains unfortunately unknown to many Canadians. For those who aren't aware of it, Phyllis was sent to the mission school out west in 1973. Even though her family didn't have a lot of money, her grandmother bought her a brand new outfit before she had to leave for her first day at school. Part of that outfit was a shiny new orange shirt. Her joy at attending school at the tender age of, I believe, 6 did not last very long. When she arrived at the school, the authorities took away all of her possessions, including her clothes, and that orange shirt, that brand new shirt, was never returned. I had the opportunity to meet Phyllis Webstad in the government lobby during the last parliament, and she talked to me about her story. She also provided me with a copy of her book, and she inscribed it for my children, who at that time were about 3 and 7. They're now 9 and 6. And what I've done since that time is read to my kids that story periodically and educate them about this very basic concept. And during this pandemic, I can tell you the anticipation that my children had on returning to school was at a very high level. But the notion of them being prevented from wearing something that I or my wife might have purchased for them really hit home to them as a visceral example of the injustice and unfairness of the residential school system. I'm glad my kids are learning about this, but the point isn't just about Phyllis's book or about my children. It's about all children and all of us as Canadians learning about this important story. We know that Phyllis at the age of 27 started a healing journey, and since then she's been able to share her story. But that story needs to be shared widely. And also, we have to think about the unshared stories, the stories of those who didn't come out of that mission school, who never returned from residential school, or those who have never found their voice or had the courage to tell it the way that Phyllis has. That's why this is such an important initiative. Now, I want to acknowledge that there are those who push the envelope on the part of reconciliation and Indigenous awareness all the time. I'm proud to call many of those my constituents in Parkdale I Park. There are many people who are actively engaged at a local level, community by community around this country on reconciliation. People who speak to me about the pace of reconciliation, that it needs to be hastened. People in my riding who speak to me about the legacy of residential schools. I've been heartened by the fact that children in my riding at a very tender age are already learning about this in their classrooms, which is critical because that's not learning that I ever received in the 1970s or 1980s as a young student here in Toronto. I'm also heartened by the fact that people are aware of the territory we are on here in Toronto, the naming of the streets and how that was occasioned in places in and around High Park, things like blanket exercises, and even things like magnificent Indigenous murals and art that decorate parts of my riding, including the beautiful mural by Philip Cote at the corner of Roncesvalles and Garden. While there are those who are aware, Madam Speaker, in my community, throughout the city and throughout this country, there are still far, far too many who are unaware, and that's what this bill clearly seeks to address. So let me talk a bit about education at this point.
We are continuing to work on reconciliation, and we have to continue with education on the issues that Inuit, Indigenous, and Métis Canadians face. It's our duty to ensure that Canadians know what has happened to Indigenous people and the repercussions of the trauma they've experienced. The statistics show that about half of Canadians know nothing or very little about Indigenous Canadians and the consequences to them. That's why it's so important to establish a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. By creating such a day, we will contribute to improving general awareness of Indigenous history. It's crucial, Madam Speaker, for these conversations to take place, whether in family, among friends or colleagues, in order to enhance understanding and to pave the way for reconciliation.
Madam Speaker, I want to talk about my own education. I alluded to this about my own experience in elementary school as a young boy here in Toronto. I practiced law prior to becoming a parliamentarian and did so for 15 years. I practiced constitutional law. That obviously means I was at law school and then was engaged in practice. While at law school, I learned very, very little, almost nothing about the residential school system. During my practice, I did not touch this area of law. It was generally understood at the time that Aboriginal law, as it was then known, was quite complicated, quite complex, and usually quite desperate in terms of leaving you with a feeling of despondence that really nothing was going to improve. Upon entering life as a parliamentarian in 2017, I had the occasion of serving as the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Heritage. The Minister of Heritage at the time was charged with working with First Nations, Inuit and Métis individuals with co-developing language protection legislation. And the minister at the time turned to me and she asked me, would you help me in this work? And I originally was puzzled as to why the ask was put in and as to what I could contribute. But in fact, that ask was actually quite pivotal to my understanding of this issue, my understanding of the broader cause of reconciliation, and to really my maturation as a parliamentarian. And what I learned during the course of those consultations, which I led literally around the country from coast to coast to coast, meeting with teachers and elders and academics and leaders, pupils and chiefs from First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities, is how critical language is as a feature of reconciliation, how critical it is to work on initiatives like this in a co-development model. And one study resonated with me, and I'll repeat it now to you again. Madam Speaker, we learned in British Columbia that those who have a knowledge of their own mother tongue, their own Indigenous language, have a suicide rate that is 6 times lower than the provincial average in British Columbia. But when you remove the language variable, you remove people's connection to their people, to their culture and their community, and suicide rates elevated 6-fold, far outstripping the provincial average for non-Indigenous people. That to me told me that there's a clear link between restoring language to people's connection to their culture, their sense of self-esteem and their confidence, and indeed suicidality rates. So it is no far-fetched hyperbole to say these are literally life and death matters for Indigenous people. And this bill is more symbolic in its nature, but it touches upon the same concept that we need to learn about that history, because in the context of language, it was residential schools that contributed to the erasing of that language. And I raise that instance for you, Madam Speaker, because it's come up in the context of this debate that, is enough work being done? And clearly more work needs to be done. But I would say that I think passing the Indigenous Language Act, passing child welfare legislation, and eliminating over 80 boil water advisories are steps in the right direction. Does more need to be done? Absolutely more needs to be done. No one of the 338 members of this House would dispute that. But I do think it's unfair to say work has not been done since 2015. I will say, Madam Speaker, that this bill C-5, talks about call to action number 80. And in call to action number 80, what we have is bill C-5. And in this bill, we recognize that Indigenous people continue to face ongoing discrimination, as I mentioned at the very outset. Systemic racism continues to be a reality. We know that in the past, Indigenous communities have gone out to the streets on their own to express their frustration and their desire for change. And what I'm glad to see now is that the rest of society is catching up, slowly, but catching up. And you see solidarity with Indigenous people voicing concerns about the Mi'kmaq, solidarity with Indigenous persons voicing concerns about Joyce Echaquan. Non-Indigenous people are awakening, and that is a good sign. And the fact that parliamentarians are awakening is a critical sign and a necessary sign. That is what that solidarity is what this bill endeavors to not just capture, but also to promote. Bill C-5 is in line with some of our government's other previous actions, such as an announcement in Budget 2019 to provide $7 million over 2 years for communities across the country to commemorate the history and legacy of residential schools. By taking this step forward, we keep raising awareness across Canada about the traumatization Indigenous peoples have undergone and the intergenerational impacts of such trauma. But I think it's important that we recognize that it's not just about learning this history on one day, on September 30th, but each and every day by thinking about it in terms of the practical work we do as parliamentarians, or indeed how we live our lives day to day as Canadians. It's a common responsibility and a duty to remember this dark chapter in Canadian history and to ensure a better future for all peoples in this country. I think we owe it to Indigenous peoples on this land. We owe it to the survivors of the residential school system. We owe it to those who did never return from the residential school system. We owe it to the parents from whom the children were taken. We owe it also to the generations to come. Having an open conversation, Madam Speaker, about residential schools and the legacy of racism and colonialism and the hardship and pain and violence that was endured is difficult. This is painful. This is uncomfortable. But we recognize that this is actually nothing in comparison to the actual experience that were lived by Indigenous peoples who went through these schools. We are committed to doing what is right with respect to Bill C-5, even though that's not an easy path. I hope all members in a strong spirit of nonpartisanship will support this bill and recognize its importance so that September 30th, 2021 can be the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. Learning our history and moving forward should never be an issue that divides on party lines. Thank you very much,